Hey fam, welcome to the Freetrail Podcast and our new presenting sponsor. We're so happy to now be working with The Feed. Thefeed.com/Freetrail is where you need to go. It is the one-stop shop for all your training and racing nutrition needs. They have over 200 of the world's best nutrition brands stocked in one website. It's a fantastic resource. We've been big customers for a long time. We're really proud to work with them. Some of my favorite products that you can find at thefeed.com/Freetrail. Gnarly Nutrition Whey Protein Powder. I like the chocolate flavor. I have some of this after every one of my workouts and long runs. For in-run nutrition, Orange Drank. You'll see my big dumb face on it. Also from Gnarly Nutrition, enhanced sodium concentration here in the world's best fueling drink mix. Finally, HVMN, Ketone IQ. I have 2 of these ketone shots basically every single day, once before I go running and once in the middle of the afternoon when I need a little extra energy. Go to thefeed.com/Freetrail and you're going to get an $80 credit, free money to spend at thefeed.com. It'll be $20 right away and then $20 every 90 days thereafter. You'll also get a sweet Trail Running Will Save the World water bottle. Again, that's thefeed.com/Freetrail. You'll get $80 credit to spend on your favorite nutrition products. And if you are international, they do ship internationally as well. So you can take care or at least take advantage of that great offering from The Feed. Big thanks to The Feed for supporting, and thank you for watching the podcast. David and Dr. Megan Roche, welcome to the Freetrail Podcast. Great to see you guys at long last.
Thank you so much for having us on. This is a blast. We were just
so
chatting.
excited.
I'm like, we want to chat for 27 hours. This is great.
Yeah, Dylan asked us, do we have a hard stop? And we're like, if you heard Dylan laughing a little bit, we were like, tomorrow.
The Hard Rock cutoff. Yes.
4 p.m.
Yeah, this will be competitive with Western States or Hard Rock live streaming length potentially. So I hope our listeners are strapped in, well fueled, well hydrated, well caffeinated, and
Someone test Dylan for PEDs, like those lozenges, you know?
Yeah.
Some of those Hall's cough drops, that probably should be banned for podcasting.
check it out. I got my electrolytes right here.
Oh my gosh.
Look at you. That's amazing. We don't have anything.
Yeah.
I feel like, in the name of our fueling and hydration, we need to step it up.
Yeah, Megan has some half-full spin drifts from like 4 weeks ago here.
I know. Who knows? Probably bugs in there. Who knows?
So we got protein. We have it all. We're bringing it.
All right, guys. Well, let's get down to business here. I always start in the same place, and it is criminal that this is only your first appearance on the show. We've been talking about doing this for a long time. We catch up intermittently every couple months or so, but this is our first time recording. People, I'm sure, know you guys intimately, but I have to pose my traditional opening question. I figured it'd be fun to have you each answer for one another. That opening question is, what makes you, you? So Megan, maybe you could start by saying a few words about what makes David, David, and then we'll turn the tables.
I love this. I get to stare in your eyes too as I say this. This is wonderful. I think to start, David's just the kindest person I've ever met. And I think anyone who's met David understands that within 15 minutes that he's like interacting with you, giving you his all. And the number of times he's just done like random things for people that are so nice. Like we've had listeners or people we've interacted with who just like reach out to us with financial troubles. And David sometimes just like send them $50 or do things that is just like, wow, like it's pretty incredible. And I think on top of that too, your brilliance is like, it's like wild. It shocks me every single day. I feel like David can like churn out legal research back in the day, and he's now used that in terms of like translating science and how we podcast, and then also just like hilariously funny. I think that kindness is layered on top of this like brutal like humor and honesty that comes together like in this perfect way, and I love it so much.
Oh my goodness gracious.
Okay, your turn, Mr. Roche.
I would say her smell.
You're real close. Is that a strength or a weakness?
It's a strength
And a weakness. Is it both?
No, I assume no. I mean, at times it has its moments, but pheromones are strong. No, I mean, I think like eventually I'll get to the brilliance thing, but a lot of people are really smart. Megan was born with a processing power beyond belief. But what sets her apart is this like openness and curiosity, almost to a fault with her own self like 10 years ago. But now she's come into it in this way where she simultaneously has this just complete like warmth and acceptance of ideas and assimilating them into her own when they're the good ideas and testing them, while also trusting herself and her own brilliance. And, you combine those things and it's just absolutely world-changing brain. And, on top of that, she's the most like warm person. And the way that manifests for me is she has this laugh that comes out sometimes. And anyone that's listened to our podcast knows what I'm talking about. We get so many people writing in that just say they will play Megan's laugh on repeat when they need to be cheered up.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah.
It's actually slightly creepy.
Yeah. Why do you think I'm sending people $50? And, that type of thing, like you just don't see that in someone that also has this complex understanding of the world and all the nastiness in it. And you combine all that and you have the most remarkable person I've ever met. And even if I wasn't her husband, I just want to like be a small part of her life and, just assimilate some of that myself.
Such a great place to start, guys. It's almost like we're renewing your wedding vows here on the Freetrail podcast. But, I wanted to jump immediately into the state of the sport stuff, but it reminds me of something that I wanted to ask you guys about, because I feel like it shines through in your podcast, the way that you're able to mix IQ and EQ. And I feel like that's sometimes, I don't know, it's unusual to see, right? Like oftentimes people who are scientifically oriented are not as good with interpersonal relationships and communication. I was actually just listening to a podcast with Nate Silver, who I think has a similar skill, sort of like a trained statistician and math guy, but who is very good at distilling complicated concepts for people like me. So maybe building on the what makes you stuff, Megan, you said maybe some of David's law background contributes to that ability, but I would love to hear you guys just talk about that, like how you're able to distill these complex concepts, usually in the realm of sports science, in a way that dumb podcasters like me can understand.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
It's a great question. I think for us, a lot of it stems from humor. Like that's kind of like how we see the world and how we engage with the world. And so I think honestly, like every step of the way, my brain throughout the day is looking for a chance to laugh. Even as I'm like combing the internet, like deep in scientific articles, I'm like, oh, that sentence funny. That's hilarious. And there is this thing, and Dylan, I'm sure you've seen this, like with your podcasting, is I think podcasting almost changes the brain in the sense that you think and see the world differently because you're a teller of stories and a teller of narratives. And so I think in some sense, it's like that craft has been honed of just like looking for funny stuff throughout the world and be like, oh, this is a chance to laugh. How about with you, David? What have you?
I think it's curiosity. It gets back to what you're saying is that if you're just genuinely open to basically everything, Megan's taught me this since I've gotten to meet her. And, our conversations aren't just on science. Like we love learning about politics and, which we tried to talk about on the podcast the other week and got some emails in return, which is so fun.
Yeah.
And we love sports. It's just really fun to engage with things and be interested in things. And, I guess the way that I connect the like seriousness of some topics and the seriousness of some science with how we try to present it is this idea that I read about recently, which is that frivolity is the point. That sometimes in life we can distill life into productivity and seriousness and all of these things that kind of lose sight of the cosmic joke of it all. I've been made fun of for grounding things in death and stuff. But I think when you do zoom out and think about the impermanence of all this, why is any of it interesting and cool and fun? And why is this sport so beautiful? It's because we can explore these things that ultimately don't matter all that much in the big scheme of things. So for us, it's running. For others, it might be video games. For others, it's, watching handball at the Olympics. But whatever it is, those frivolous things are what makes life worth living. And so we want to share those frivolous things with people with that same passion that they might bring to it, depending on what the topic is.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks so much for what you guys do. And I feel like I have learned so much from you just from listening to all the stuff that you put out. And I feel like this is a good opportunity to go a little bit deeper on a lot of the stuff. When we talked while we were setting this up, we figured it might be best to sort of orient things around state of the sport. Obviously, it's been a dramatic and entertaining summer so far. And what I think the top line story is in trail running, in cycling, in track and field is that everybody is getting better, everybody's getting faster. And in a recent podcast that you guys did, you listed a bunch of reasons. And I want to just kind of tick through some of them and spend a few minutes on them and allow you guys to use your scientific knowledge and ability to communicate that scientific knowledge for our audience here. Let's begin with fueling, because it feels like that is sort of like the biggest revolution that's happening, opening the door to that, whoever wants to get us started. Actually, maybe David, this is a good thing for you. On a recent podcast, you basically said that it's not only, that it makes you stronger in your workouts, but also enhances your ability to adapt to that stimulus. So explain that for our audience.
Yeah, we have a shorthand term that was coined by a podcast listener called food doping, that what we're seeing across sports needs to be contextualized in that broader sense, because I think it's easy to write off the ultra running leaps to a certain extent and say, well, in the big scheme of things, the denominator of the sport is not so hyper developed that you wouldn't expect statistically to see these leaps over time and this constant progression. But let's go to a sport like cycling, where they have been pushing the limits forever. And, to the extent that there has been substantial cheating that has been well documented, in the Lance Armstrong years and things like that, that sport is seeing a growth leap in the same exact way, to the point that I read a really interesting article that the 29th place finisher this year was Egan Bernal. Egan Bernal won the Tour de France like 4 or 5 years ago, and his power numbers are the same. So there's leaps happening that we're seeing not just in running. And what connects all of this? I think our answers kind of have to, derive from endurance sports generally, rather than like training theory for ultras specifically, because it clearly goes deeper. And that's where fueling comes in as the number one thing. It's that 10 years ago in cycling, 10 years ago in ultra running, there's an understanding that, well, maybe you want to fuel with the least you can, because that will improve your fat oxidation. And what we've learned recently is that fat oxidation just comes from training. There's a lot of great studies on this, in that, except at the very margins for some male athletes, the more substrate you have on board with your glycogen capacities, obviously that will help performance on the day of. But then the coolest part is that the hormonal response, in particular, the endocrine system response, will be conducive to adaptation subsequently. And so when our listener said food doping, obviously it's a little bit of a touchy subject, but I think it's a good way to conceive of it for athletes that might be on the fence. It's that your body, by doing this, will adapt so much more rapidly, and the stress that you're under will be absorbed so much more readily, that the subsequent leaps in performance will absolutely make minuscule any of the day of changes. So obviously it helps day of, but the coolest part is you zoom out a year, 2 years, you're looking at just these massive performance leaps that have defined all endurance sports.
So Megan,
okay.
Yeah. Okay. Build on that. But also what I'm curious about is to get more practical on the in-run fueling, and doing this 100 plus grams an hour is a big thing. Is there anything that people should be considering based on recent literature as to the daily nutrition, the stuff around the training too?
Actually, yeah, that's actually exactly where I was going, is there's this kind of general recommendation of higher carb fueling in the 90 gram to 120 grams of carbs per hour realm. And certainly we've had so many better products to help get us there too. We have these higher grams of carbs gels, we have liquid fueling options. It's suddenly much easier to put that together now that we've kind of had these scientific recommendations. But on top of that too, it's also not what athletes are doing just within exercise. It's we have this broader fueling conversation outside of exercise, where now we have athletes that we have a larger denominator of healthy athletes that are avoiding low energy availability and stepping to the start line and having stronger hormonal responses, stronger recovery, stronger performance. And I feel it's creating this denominator in sport of athletes that are healthy, that are strong, and that are adapting to training from the training stimulus itself. And then all of the good carbohydrates, fat, protein fueling that happens outside of the exercise landscape as well.
Yeah. So breakdown, training is breakdown, and breakdown without adaptation is self-destruction. We're essentially seeing that self-destruction knob turn down all the way to zero in a lot of these sports where we're having, methodical approaches to nutrition. And so we call it the slurp revolution.
Yeah, right.
All these athletes that are learning to slurp these carbs. And, I think people see it firsthand for themselves. It's all of a sudden everyone is riding this wave. I'm riding the wave personally as an athlete, where I, am not training as much as I used to in some ways, but I'm running faster than I ever have. And I'm shit, I wish I knew this stuff when I was 25. It would
Me
have been...
too. That's exactly what I thought too.
Yeah.
It reminds me too, something that you mentioned on the podcast that I'd love to dig into a little bit. And you sort of said it in passing, David, but it was something about how maybe this fueling revolution has decreased the overemphasis on body composition. And the way I interpreted that was that people are less focused on weight. And I don't know, as a bigger guy who's been a little self-conscious about that throughout my career, I thought that was a really unique insight. Like maybe this fueling revolution is reducing the myopic focus on strength to weight ratios. Anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately what this comes down to is that fueling adequately helps you find your strong. And that is the framework that I think has been really hard traditionally. I remember when I first became a runner or considered running, I had someone tell me this equation for body weight that I should follow to reach my running peak performance. And I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And I was like trying to reach it and just could not stay healthy for the life of me and wasn't very fast. And I remember doing some races and being happy to finish like 47th, which is great. 47th is amazing. But ultimately, compared to what I would do in the future, it's like that was always a mistake to try to follow equations. And instead, what I should have been doing is understanding that every body type is different. And what the ultimate goal of all of those body types is to be strong. Because just like cycling is a watts sport, it's about how many watts you can put out. Running is a power sport. How much power per stride can you put out? And the best example is from cycling, actually, which is Jonas Abrahamsson, who was in the mountain leader jersey, the polka dot jersey for a lot of this year's Tour de France. He very publicly gained 20 kilograms of weight, so like 44 pounds intentionally a few years ago, because he learned this himself, that trying to fit narratives of what cyclists should look like didn't work. By being his own version of strong, which is bigger than a lot of other of his competitors strong, he became a mountain champion and it all just gets down to, screw playing around with these denominators of weight. Think about that numerator of power. Let that power number get higher.
I also think too, the paradoxical thing as well is that if you're fueling really well, like if you're in these like higher grams of carbs categories, it actually like turns the fire up on the body. And so the metabolism kicks on too. And so ironically, it's like actually in a lot of athletes, they might see what they consider to be like improvements in body composition, whether that's relevant or not, but the metabolism actually turns on. And I think that's like one of the wildly cool parts is like stoke the metabolism, turn that on. And like, I've seen, female athletes struggle or male athletes struggle with low energy availability. And it's like the metabolism becomes this like, simmering stove that's been turned off. And you really want to turn that on.
Yeah. Calories in, calories out is a broken equation that is not the way it works in practice, especially for endurance athletes. And basically a lot of this talk really only applies to endurance athletes, because once you start to get to, people that might live more sedentary lifestyles, some of those rules might apply. But for us, you just want that fire to be burning so bright, because that fire burning bright, proxy for adaptation, also proxy for feeling good in life, proxy for having good sexual health, good, endocrine, like all of the things that go into being human, can be like really insisted by endurance training or greatly hindered. And we want to be on the framework of saying, hey, endurance training can be the most badass, uplifting, joyous thing in the world. But the prerequisite for that is getting a lot of fuel down your mouth.
Yeah. What a comforting thing. And that cycling anecdote is so powerful. Gaining 40 pounds and then being the king of the mountains in the sport that is known for people restricting calories and has been for decades. Moving to cooling, Megan, you said on a recent podcast something about how the first 20 minutes of your run and your heart rate response in that first 20 minutes is impacted by how you sort of pre-cool yourself. And again, this is one of those things where I didn't quite fully understand what you meant. So maybe go a little bit deeper on that specific thing, but then also like this cooling revolution in general. We've seen it in trail running, cycling, track and field, and how that's contributing to this massive leap forward we're experiencing.
Yeah, well, I'm pregnant right now. So I feel like I spend my life in exercise just like jumping between bodies of water, some of which are a little sketchy. It's like there's a lot of mold in there. That's definitely an irrigation ditch. But I feel like even outside of pregnancy too, for me, the first 20 minutes of a run kind of sets up the heart rate landscape and where I'm headed for the rest of the run. And I find for myself, I've seen this personally in athletes, and we see it in the research too, is that like, if you really like go into that first 20 minutes at a harder effort, at a higher body temperature, it sets that trajectory for the rest of the run. And I think this is where like you see in Olympics right now, and it's hot in Paris, there are ice vests all over those starting lines. Mountain bikers wearing them up until I'm like, the gun's about to go off, and they're like still wearing their cooling vests. And I don't know, I'm the type of person that I'm like chronically early, and I feel like I would have that off 5 minutes before the gun goes on, but they leave them on for like a long time.
And then you underperform.
I know, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think that 20 minutes of cooling, of especially like, you know, if you're warming up for a race, of activating the aerobic system really helps set the trajectory. But we're seeing advances in cooling from ice vests to ice bandanas. Lululemon at the Further Project this year had like all these different ice contraptions everywhere, and it's making a big difference in sport.
Yeah. So basically core temp and cardiac demand are very linked across all the research. And so it's not just core temp, but core temp interacts with the temperature of your skin surface, which is why at Western States, you think so much about athletes getting wet and wearing these long sleeves and things like that. Because as soon as that core temp starts to rise, the demand on the heart is going to grow greater, just as it would if you go faster. And what they're seeing is if you can work on keeping your body cool, it's a huge difference. And my favorite studies on this are not the like retro or the control studies with 12 participants. It's when you look at marathon performances across years at these big city marathons, and they'll see standard deviation changes from temperatures that go from like 55 degrees Fahrenheit to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So even at those really relatively low temperatures, we're seeing the impact on performance. And it's like, well, we should all then start cooling even when it's 60 degrees or even cooler. Like anytime you're running in the sun, unless you're going to freeze your ass off, you should be trying to cool as much as you can, because you're going to get plenty of passive heat acclimation in the context of your training, especially in the summer. Maybe if you're training for Western States and you're in a cool place, it's a little different. But other than that, the goal is to perform well in training, to make training take less effort so that your running economy can improve. And if you can do that, sky's the limit. So cooling ends up being, inexorably linked with actual effort levels and output.
So crazy. Cool. So then moving to super shoes, I feel like this was something that you guys were really early to. And I don't know, I guess I was unconvinced until Western States this year where, basically everybody that had a good day was racing in a carbon plated shoe. Anything you want to say about that beyond what you've what's obvious and what you've said on the podcast? I mean, obviously, like in road racing and with the original 4% shoe, it was a lot easier to create the types of conditions where you could really measure the advantage, where in trail running, that seems a little bit more complicated. So opening the door on the super shoe conversation, if there's anything that's advanced in the research department there that actually proves it's an advantage, or are we relying just on subjective anecdotal evidence at this point?
Ooh, we're subjective as hell right now.
I know. Well, we're relying a lot on road shoe data, which is the hard part. And there's like tons and tons of road shoe data. I mean, it's actually some interesting stuff coming out about how individualized it is. Like some people may get 2% from a shoe. Some people may get 6% from a shoe.
Some people negative 1%, depending on the shoe.
Yeah. And so it's like all about how that shoe fits on an individual athlete. But the trail world, in terms of the super shoes, is kind of the Wild West. Like we have very limited data on how these shoes are performing across trail conditions, across trail environments. I think on a whole, yes, it's beneficial. Is it 4%? I question that.
I bet it's more.
You think it's more?
I bet it's more. Yeah. So I've been very fortunate that Megan's been pregnant as I've been testing all of these different super shoes. Yeah. And so I do some semi-subjective analysis on myself when it comes to treadmill workouts, and have gotten to see that, yes, there is an advantage for these like road shoes, but not quite there yet, depending on the brand and the model. And the reason I think that we're ultimately going to be seeing trail shoes that are worth even more than the road shoe counterpart is because of how much fatigue ends up making a difference, particularly on climbs in running. And so if the shoes are designed to essentially keep people away from those fatigue barriers, that if we're measuring their impact over 1+ hours, we're going to start to see, breakdowns of form with regular shoes that are just, pretty incomprehensible. And seeing the shoes that are out there, the scariest thing for me is I do not think we're there yet. I think the trail super shoes are getting there, but we're basically in 2015 in road shoes, and eventually we're going to hit 2016 when the Vaporfly comes on the market, and everything is going to change. So I think that the Adidas, the Agravic Speed Ultra that they came out with this year is getting there, and it's very good. But all of these shoes right now have certain limitations. I bet if we re-record this in 3 years, what we're saying is that you will not be able to compete anywhere near your potential unless you have one of these shoes, much like we're seeing in roads. But question becomes like, which companies are the first to crack the code? Thus far, I've gotten to test all of them. And for anyone that's run on roads, the code has clearly not been cracked yet. Yeah. But they're getting so damn close. They're like right at the precipice. We're talking like, those big experiments they did in Britain in World War II. We're like right there. It's going to happen soon. And I think the next 2 years are going to be a fundamental reshifting of the sport. And the sport's going to, as a result, going to get even faster, even without all the performance changes of cooling, fueling, and some of the other stuff we're going to talk about.
Actually, I need to chime in as an inside story.
Oh, no.
As David is very into shoes, like concerningly into shoes. I'm a little bit worried about his habit. He had this scale out yesterday, like a kitchen scale out, purely for the purpose, we don't ever measure our food, purely for the purpose of measuring shoes. And he got a bunch of different super shoes wet and like controlled measure their weight as they were wet. And actually it was eye-opening.
And we're not going to talk about that in here because we don't want to like
give the data. Yes.
We don't want to shit on any shoe brand, essentially. But there are, and it points out why trail shoes, why it's so complicated and why the code takes more time to be cracked in some ways, is that the foams themselves, once you submerge them, different formulations absorb water and retain it differently. So one shoe in particular gained 2 ounces even after 90 minutes after being submerged and being run on.
Wow.
And at that point, you're just losing whatever benefit it is because shoe economy is largely related to weight. And that's another place where trail super shoes aren't there yet, is like many of them are quite heavy. And from studies on running economy, like 1 ounce in dropping, shoe weight has a direct impact on running economy that outstrips what benefit you're going to be getting from the carbon plate and the foam eventually. So, there's a lot of open variables. And I think the hard part becomes that the trail companies aren't doing the R&D that the road ones are when it comes to like the extreme amounts of testing. And that's essentially the barrier that's going to be broken, I think, in the next couple of years, is once you combine all of that, get these answers, it's going to be wild. And who I love following for this actually is Brett Hornig. Absolute superstar in the Conversational Pace podcast, understands these shoes so well. And I think he's going to help push it forward because he's making these companies more accountable to not just say your shoes are faster, it's like show it.
Yeah. Okay, great. Shout out Brett Hornig. Such a fascinating thing, such an exciting moment for product development in the space. All right, let's maybe buckle a couple of these things together before we move on and talk about more stuff that you guys are specifically doing. You mentioned also, the depth of talent. That's pretty obvious. People are just pushing each other to go faster. But one thing that you guys mentioned that I thought was really interesting is how you are specifically advising your athletes to engage with sports psychiatrists, therapists, and really honing the mental part of the performance game too, and that was part of this equation leading to the massive breakthroughs that we've been seeing. Say more about that, the mental side of things.
Oh, you see it at the Olympics right now. I feel like every conversation on gymnastics is like, she's worked so hard. He's worked so hard on the mental craft. And granted, ultra runners aren't flying like 15 feet in the air, but it's still like we're showing up and asking a lot of our bodies. We're asking to push for many hours and do things that are like, we're pushing the limits of human performance. And I think honestly, you don't have to be an ultra runner to access a therapist. You don't have to have a mental health, crisis or a mental health challenge to access a therapist. Like, I just think there's such amazing resources for talking about life. Like, I see a therapist and honestly, I just enjoy getting to talk to her every 2 weeks. I'm like, this is great. Yeah. And I just think the more people that have access to open up and talk about life, whatever it is, whether that's ultra running or gymnastics or talking about your business or your dog or your family, it's like, it's such a gift. And I wish, I think one thing is I just wish people had more access to it. And that's something that I've thought about within stuff I want to do in the future, but I think it's been game changing for sport.
Yeah. And some of the more interesting studies are on self-talk interventions. super simple, where you prime athletes to learn how to, help their internal monologue during exercise. And they see bigger performance improvements from that over just very short interventions that then stick than they do from any super shoe, any intervention that we're talking about.
Isn't that crazy?
It's so cool.
Yeah. And you think about that doesn't just apply to running. It applies to everything. And doesn't just apply to day of. It gets back to the same conversation from the fueling. It's like, well, let's say you're doing a 5 by 3 minute hill, and just being a little bit kinder to yourself and more self-accepting makes you 2 seconds faster. It's like, oh, well, that's nothing. Like, that's within the margin of error, right? But what happens when your body then adapts to that, and then adapts to the next time, and adapts to the next time? And you're looking at a year, you have a fundamentally different athlete that has nothing to do with physiology. It all starts in the brain. And because, one of the ways we try to ground training theory too is, I think sometimes we think so much about physiology and like lactate clearance and things like that. But all of this comes from the nervous system, and the nervous system is brain mediated. So yeah, there's some central processes that are a little bit deeper than that, but especially in ultras, we're talking about how the brain interacts with the body, and you can't escape from that. Maybe in the 400 meter dash, there's a little bit more of like performance psychology that matters, like performance anxiety. But in ultras, it is just tapping into how can the brain unlock what the body's actually capable of. And I don't think we know the answer to that question. And, the athletes that are excelling now are giving a template that like, well, maybe we're all capable of way more than we think. And that doesn't just apply to winners, it applies to the entire field. And the coolest part is, if that goes outside of running and outside of exercise, it can go to everything we do in life, how we are as parents, partners. And most importantly, do we treat ourselves with kindness, because that's what life ends up coming down to in the end.
Fascinating. It reminds me, actually, Hannah Allgood, one of your athletes, Megan, was on the podcast after her great 5th place performance at Transwilkania, and she was talking about her sports psychology and the affirmations process that she goes through before races. And obviously she's just coming off a huge victory, her first international win at the Eiger Trail by UTMB. So just another awesome advancement in the sport that is contributing to this massive leap forward that we've taken. Speaking more specifically about what you guys have been up to, David, I'd love to talk about, doing the Olympic trials, track and field, plus Western States. I mean, what a great opportunity to kind of compare and contrast where trail running is compared to our more advanced sister sport. You were there, I think, supporting Ali Ostrander and Anna Gibson there. So having experienced both, talk a little bit about where trail running is and, specifically, I don't know, like how you would compare something like the track and field Olympic trials to Western States specifically, or trail running generally.
Yeah, I think that running is running. So the performance end of the spectrum is kind of similar. I think the one place that felt a little bit jarring almost to go from Eugene, where the trials were, down to Forest Hill, was almost in like, I'm trying to think of how to say this in a kind of, I feel like trails is reaching a point where it's almost at times there's some over seriousness about the pursuits that on road or in track, the athletes themselves, yes, are very serious about what they're doing, but then people around the sport aren't being so freaking intense all the time. It's kind of an interesting vibe because the athletes are freaking locked in. Like seeing Nikki Hiltz before they went out and won the 1500 meter, like Nikki is the most delightful person, but that is a freaking competitor. Anna Gibson, before the first heat in the 1500 meters, I was just talking with her the whole time, running with her. And then she gives me a fist bump with a half hour to go and says, time to lock in. And then I'm just there with ice the rest of the time.
Love it.
So that seriousness is there. And that should be, athletes should do what they need to do to get locked in. But the most fun I had sometimes was as athletes went back under the tunnel, as Ali and Anna did, just getting to talk to the coaches, the massage therapists, everyone around the sport, who I think there was a certain amount of lightness about it, even as they were all very serious, they were very nervous and ready to go, that I worry sometimes that as trails becomes more prominent and, there are more stakes here, that everybody starts treating it like, I don't know, the Super Bowl over time, like everything comes down to this and all that matters is who wins and stuff like that. So I think there's a balance there that, is a growth pain that I'm sure all sports face at a certain point. But I mean, at its core, trail is the coolest thing in the world, and the people are incredible.
Well, I think one thing I saw is just the growth potential of trails. Is I was sitting there at the track and I was so captivated at like the Olympic trials. Like it's being there and watching some of the best athletes in the world compete. And it's like, this is a gift. But no way did I want to go on that track, put on a pair of bloomers and run in circles. Whereas being at Western States, I was like, put me out on the trails. Let me cross this river. This is so fun. And I think trail running is just in this place compared to, and track is growing, it's rapidly growing. There's a lot of people investing in the sport, much like there is in trail running. But I think trail running just captivates the audience in a way that our denominator is growing rapidly in sport. And a lot of that's thanks to Freetrail and what you guys are doing. Your efforts have been incredible in terms of growing trail culture and awareness. And it's just like, it's also such a great sport that's fun. And it was interesting to be at both places and kind of see that dichotomy.
Yeah. Basically, my comments can be distilled to, if Freetrail wins, we win.
Right.
We all win.
What about Swap? What about Swap?
Swap is we're riding the Freetrail coattails.
Right.
Yeah, right. We're colleagues. This is great. This is perfect.
We're watching Rowan this morning. Like, we're like the smaller rower that's rowing at the front. You got like two oars.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, so actually this Ali and Anna conversation reminds me of something that I changed my mind on recently. I was sort of always operating with the thesis that as trail running got more professional, more competitive, that it would increase the specialization of athletes. And Ali and Anna are sort of the most prominent counter examples of that, being able to race at the highest level in both sports. So maybe that would be a fun thing to chat about quickly as we sort of are meditating on the state of the sport and the future. And being at the track and field Olympic trials plus Western States, do you guys feel like this hybrid athlete model is going to be something we see more of?
Absolutely. You just need to see her to be her. And I love what Anna did this year, because Anna went from Broken Arrow VK, came back into the trials and advanced to the semis. Absolutely remarkable. But the whole point becomes, what these sports come down to are very similar physiological variables.
Oh yeah, running is running. Yeah.
And some of the coolest studies are actually, I think that when we think about UTMB or one of these mountain ultras, everyone's like, well, there's a million variables. It's fueling, it's logistics, it's running along the mountains. Hey, guess what the studies say? It's VVO2. It's your velocity at VO2 max that is the main performance predictor. What is the main performance predictor in the 1500 meters? It is velocity at VO2. So obviously those variables do matter. But when we're talking about this in a concrete way, I think what we're seeing on trails in the performance improvements is essentially we're seeing faster athletes, athletes that are reaching their own speed potential on trails. Similarly, on the track, people like Anna and Ali are strong as fuck in ways that just help them level up in that sport. And so I think the development cycles all feed back in that essentially if an athlete builds their own personal speed and maintains that year round, and then you mix that with aerobic development, you have like a physiological flexibility that will help you adapt over multiple years. Whereas in the past, I think trails were very focused on specificity. It's like, if I'm doing hard rock, I just go up and down mountains for 3 months, then I recover for a month, and then I'm slow as shit and I try to like whatever. And the point now is I think athletes are like, actually, the best way to get better at all of this stuff is to build the aerobic system in a bunch of different ways while keeping speed high. And you can do that through cross training. You can do that via running up mountains. You can do that via track workouts. Like all of the like beautiful menagerie of running and pursuits can play into this like whole where an athlete becomes capable of way more than they expected they could early on in their journey.
I also think too, it's like a mental superpower to do them both and to be able to like bounce from one to the other and avoid burnout, and to also have like, I think sometimes we get so locked into these identities of who we are as a person. Like, I'm a track runner, or I'm a trail runner, and being flexible in identity is almost like a mental superpower. And showing up like at the Broken Arrow VK and being like, yeah, this race is great, but I'm also on the track next week at the Olympic trials. And I think it's like a mental superpower to have flexible identities, and being different and unique is a big part of that.
And maybe Grayson Murphy leading the way, when she competing on roads, track, and then coming into trails and being the best climber we've ever seen. And simply put, running economy on flats will determine your climbing ability. And obviously downhills introduce a lot more complications, which is why mountain races get a little bit messier. But if you just think running economy is running economy to a certain extent, I think it helps everyone optimize what they're capable of. Even people that might be chasing cutoffs, like that's an amazing pursuit. But if that athlete improves their 5K time by 30 seconds, they're going to have so much better outcomes in the 100-milers. And I think that's what people like Grayson and Anna and Ali show us. And what I think they're going to prove, and what Anna is going to prove, and Grayson and Ali and others, is that it actually goes the other way too.
Yeah.
That excelling at these big mountain races will lead to athletes that have kicks like you wouldn't freaking believe on the track.
Wow, that's so interesting. So as the coach to all those athletes, I think you coach Mika Boudon-Rousseau too, who's in that same hybrid athlete camp. Is that the biggest insight that you've gained as a coach, is just how similar the stimulus is that leads to high level performance?
Yeah, I mean, there was a great study on cyclists that came out just a couple weeks ago that was talking about fatigue resistance, or durability. If you listen to our podcast, it's one of our main talking points. But every time a study comes about it, we talk about it. Yeah. And what the researchers there posited is that at the end of the day, what matters in cycling, and everyone knows this, is functional threshold power, essentially velocity at lactate threshold, your 1 hour effort, whatever. And same stuff applies to running. Like Mika being a great example, where he was injured a lot this year with kind of an unexplained knee situation. And we had to get creative, and we worked on uphill treadmill a lot. And he got to the point where his 1 hour power output on the uphill treadmill was bonkers. Like it was like one of the highest I've ever seen, but he wasn't able to do any flat stuff. So he goes and does a flat workout and is beating some of his paces when he was at Stanford training just for that from the uphill treadmill. And it points out,
damn,
this works in different ways than maybe we've even measured in labs yet. That, you know, the velocity of VO2 max, which is maybe a simpler way to say it for everyone, but for a very advanced athlete like Mika, who doesn't have the mechanical limitations, VLT, velocity lactate threshold, like when that gets optimized, like it kind of just applies in every which way, and that those adaptations can happen long term. So, I mean, it's been a joy to work with these athletes because they're so smart, and then they push you as a coach to like learn more. And then that challenge from the athlete ends up hopefully moving like at least our personal training theory forward.
What an exciting time for the sport. Megan, moving to the Western States medical research stuff, this is obviously something that you're very involved with as the co-medical research director with Emily Krause. I'd love to hear what went on this year at Western States, the smart people in sports science. What are they thinking about right now, and how do you and Emily support their ability to advance our collective knowledge about the space?
Well, Western States has been so fun because I feel like it's this like population of people that are so interested in science, which like you often don't get. Like I've done a lot of scientific studies, and you're like trying to get people to participate with like, you know, incentives and like sending them 8 million email reminders. And it's really hard to get them to do things. But ultra runners like science, and it's amazing to have them as like research participants. So there's two different studies. One was a bone stress injury study looking at like bone health, bone stress injuries, and energy availability. And that was one that was led by Stanford, and specifically actually looking at a hormonal marker called free T3, which is a thyroid hormone that's kind of an early indicator of low energy availability. And so like gathering some initial data on that. And then there was a kidney study that was looking at like historically at Western States, actually, we've had several athletes on dialysis and several athletes that have had like long-term kidney issues post-race. And so seeing if we can kind of help alleviate that with identifying some early markers of muscle breakdown and potentially like early kidney injury.
Very, very interesting. Maybe, I know you guys are doing a full tribute on your podcast, and by the time ours comes out, you will have already said, you know, what you want to say about Maddie Giegold. But this week in the Western States family, there was a tragic passing of somebody I know you were close with. So I feel like it is appropriate to just say a few words about Maddie, what she meant to the team, how you interfaced with her through your work at Western States and in other places.
Yeah. Oh, Maddie. I coached Maddie for 8+ years. And I think with anyone that you coached for that long, but especially with Maddie, because she's this like life force and this energy ball of a human that I think anyone that meets her for 5, 10, 15 minutes is like, wow, this is my new best friend, is the kind of personality that she has. She just has like such an impact on you. And she came in at Western States and has volunteered. She volunteered at the Lululemon Further Project. She came in and was volunteering, but pivotal at Western Western States in terms of like medical direction and helping out Andy Pasternak. And she passed suddenly. And it's been a hard week for us just thinking about like so many people impacted by Maddie, and just like someone with that level of life force and life energy. It's like, how does that happen? Like, she was a larger than life force. And I'm just like honored that we got to know her, honored the world had her, because like, I mean, she made all of us better people. And I just like, I hope I can carry on like an ounce of her spirit when I do.
She put 100 lives into her short time, way too short time. The most interesting thing has happened this week, which is we've gotten probably 150 messages from people that have met her. And often they are people that met her for 5 minutes, that this person was such a ball of light in the world that you meet her for 5 minutes. Not only do you feel better about yourself, because that's what she was an expert at, but you feel better about humanity as a whole. And to think that this all came from someone that was brilliant, that felt things like, mental health issues and felt everything, and also was very aware of injustices in the world and advocated for those so strongly, but then came out the other end with like arms wide open, lifting people up, whether she was best friends for years or best friends for 5 minutes. It's like, that's everything, not just in the sport, but like in life, in the universe. Like, that is the energy that I hope we can channel. And
it's been wild to me. Like, I've lost family members. I've gone through loss before, but this grief process has been one that like I haven't quite known before. And I think it's because she was such a special person. And it's really opened my eyes up to anyone that's dealing with grief. Like, I went for a run on Tuesday and I made it like 200 meters and then just wound up like crying and walking out there for 3 miles, and just how much of an impact, like it just goes to show that like she's such a special person. But also like big hugs out there to anyone that's navigating this process alongside us with Maddie, or is dealing with other versions of grief too, and just how that intersects with training and life. And even just like sometimes during this week, I've just been like wandering around like, what am I doing right now? And realizing I'm aimlessly thinking about Maddie. And so, anyone who's gone through grief out there, which is probably a lot of people, and probably a lot of people connected with Maddie because she was such a special human, we're just sending big loves and big hugs.
Yeah, she was a supernova. And like that, she spread like all of everything about life into the universe via her light.
Well, thanks for sharing, guys. I know it's probably not easy to talk about. I didn't know her personally myself, but Andy Pasternak, the medical director from Western States, sent out a touching email to the board where he made it clear that she was one of those unicorn people who he had identified as a potential successor, or somebody who was going to make a big difference in the race itself, but in the sport more generally. So our hearts are with Maddie's family, and I'm sorry for both of your guys' loss. A very awkward transition to come back to talking more about your guys' coaching specifically, and sort of building on this IQ versus EQ thing. I'd love to just have you guys talk a little bit about the process that you go through. Megan, you said earlier of like combing the internet, looking for science, but yeah, just like give us a sense of that practice. Like, how are you guys actually aggregating the knowledge that you have? And if there's anything that comes to mind about, maybe something that you've learned recently, or something that has forced you to rethink a previously held coaching philosophy, I think that would be interesting.
You should see our text messages.
That's what I was just going to say. I feel like you just need to have a relationship where you both are really, really concerningly into science. So basically, whenever I get a text from David, usually it's like, sometimes it's logistics.
4:45 a.m.
I know, it's like I'm just waking up in bed and it's this like new scientific article. And we just talk about it constantly together. And I think maybe find a person in the world that is like interested in science and have those conversations. Like, a lot of our dinners devolve into science conversations, and it's fun and it's filled with humor. I think both of us are just endlessly curious. I have journal access through Stanford still, which is amazing, and can access the full article beyond the abstract, which is always clutch for like doing that deeper dive. But honestly, we get a lot of our stuff like wildly from what used to be Twitter, so X. Yeah. Some great like sports science stuff on there. We go to the journals themselves, and then like engage with podcasts and other places too.
Yeah, so we basically have 15 journals that we just check all their all their new releases, super easy. Anybody can do that. Very, it's fun because even if it's interesting to like your work, you can learn about like ACL injuries in soccer just by skimming an abstract, and that develop some way that might add to your broader knowledge. Because like all things, it's like why learning the humanities is important before you get into engineering, because you never know what little neurons you're going to connect to make some breakthrough. But then on top of that, like Megan said, like, I hate to be the guy that's like, check out
X.
But if you follow the right people there, like you're always on top of things. Like a good example is this guy named Daniel Rowland. I don't know him, never interacted with him personally, but amazing follow because he'll just throw out a study from 2016 and you're like, I never thought about that topic. And then whenever we're talking about a specific thing or thinking about it, we just like to do, classic lit searches. Anytime we look at a study, we always look at the studies that it is citing to try to see like what the path is of the literature and just understand it. That's where like legal research might come in, because that's a path that you've used there, because no study in 2024 is inherently more valuable than one in 2012, and understanding that history. And then over time, it just forms this narrative. And like, on that note, something that we've been pushed on recently, and we might talk about next week on the podcast, that I was always skeptical about is sodium bicarbonate. So we talked about performance changes in sport. We're not sponsored by, any of these companies, so we can say it's well, they're at the feed. Yeah. Use Dylan's code for the feed.
Yeah.
Everybody. But a study just came out this week on sodium bicarb that found 54-second improvement in 40K time trials in cyclists taking it before, overlaps with what we've seen in practice. And earlier this year, I started to change my tune to the point that before the Leadville 100, even though it's not proven in these really long races, I'm going to be taking a half dose before the start. And, it's one of those places where what sodium bicarbonate does is it changes the pH context of your bloodstream so that when lactate and the hydrogen ions associated with lactate come in, add some acidity to your bloodstream, it buffers that acidity process, theoretically can help the performance context of muscle fibers. Theoretically, that should only work at more intense performance levels, right? And that's what studies have found so far, but they haven't been tested in ultras. And Killian very famously was doing this in 2022 at UTMB. We didn't know what it was at the time.
Yeah, I remember that.
But he was doing it. And my guess is that some of the performance benefits we're seeing in cycling for sure, on the track for sure, maybe in ultra running, is related to this intervention. And then,
but it's like, how do you even dose it? Like,
no, we don't know any.
How do you dose sodium bicarb for UTMB?
Right.
It's like,
and what are the long-term impacts?
Yeah.
And does it, yeah, I mean, and it's expensive as hell. There's a bunch of problems, but it points out that you need to be open to these things, because otherwise you just find yourself being a follower where you're 5 years behind every trend. And one thing we want to do is, yes, we'll be wrong sometimes, but we're at least going to be at the front end of things that we think are healthy to a certain, like if it has health impacts, we're going to be late. But, in that case, like, I think that's one place where we're starting to push our own limits and challenge our own assumptions with ultra athletes.
So is this sodium bicarb thing part of what you just identified as your biggest hobby horse, that being fatigue resistance? Is it part of that formula?
Probably it is, but we don't know the mechanism. So that's the complicated thing with sodium bicarb, is if it's related to this lactate process, lactate really only starts to accumulate above LT2. So like what we've been calling 1 hour effort, though it can be a little harder. So maybe it only really applies at these harder events like they've been studied, but lactate generation matters at every level. And we haven't done lactate measurements on athletes at the end of Western States, but I guarantee we're seeing curves that would blow the science out of the water. Like, it's just very weird. The physiology gets weird.
Yeah.
And in that context, what makes a difference? I mean, it's tough to know, because lactate generation and the fatigue processes are also related to your glycogen burn rate and all the other things that go into how you're going to fatigue as an event goes on. So, and then a weird anecdote, again, purely anecdotal, is for myself, I'm a cramp boy. And since
Cramp boys unite.
Yeah, cramp boys unite. I'll cramp anywhere. Most people cramp in their quads and their calves. I'll cramp in my freaking thumb.
Oh, you'll cramp anywhere.
Oh, yeah.
That is true.
Neck muscles, fingers, yeah.
Yeah, and
at random times.
You ever had a nose cramp? I haven't, but I will. But since I've started this intervention thus far, like in the Silver Rush 50, not even a hint of anything, which is so weird.
It's probably related to the sodium loading.
And so the idea being maybe it's related, like this is you're taking grams of sodium, which could have its own downsides, but maybe there are things that we're not sure of. And there was a study a couple years ago that, when we were doing our lit search, that never got talked about, that was related to mitochondrial function and how that's might be positively impacted. So you don't know. And I guess that also brings up the concern of all this is when you don't know, there could be downstream impacts that are negative. And a good example of that might be ketones, which is, I took ketones after my run today. So post-exercise ketones, it's complicated though, because we have seen anecdotally, and then a study came out late last year that it could have hormonal impacts to do long-term ketone use, where it could affect testosterone production in both female and male athletes.
I see it more staggeringly actually in female athletes, to the point where I actually have female athletes get blood biomarkers done if they're going to start ketones, and then 3 months later do it again. That's being said, I think post-exercise ketones are a big part of some of the performance changes that we're seeing in sport, but we just have to be informed about how we think about it.
I mean, at the Tour de France, those guys are freaking guzzling that stuff at the finish line. But they don't also care about their long-term health. And I think all we care about, I do not care if an athlete wins Western States or UTMB if they are sacrificing their health in any way. And so basically all of this comes with an enormous disclaimer and asterisk, which is when you push the limits of human performance, you don't always know what's going to come out a year from now. And that's complicated when you're at the cutting edge of science, and thinking about this stuff too is, we'll be wrong. And we've been wrong before about our theory, but hopefully we'll adapt in the meantime.
Yeah, awesome. Geez, learned so much from you guys. So speaking of pushing the limits of human performance and the Silver Rush 50, David, you smashed it, buddy.
Thank you.
Crushed.
Yeah. So anyway, I'd love to hear you just talk about that. But I don't know. I think the thing that it's funny, right? Because I've known you guys for a long time. I've known you guys to be incredible athletes for a long time. But most people think of you first and foremost as coaches and scientists, right? And so obviously this was a great reminder to everybody about just how talented you are as an athlete. You characterized it as your best race ever, potentially, or at least long distance race. So tell the people about the Silver Rush 50 and how you're thinking about your big 100-mile debut coming up in a couple of weeks.
Okay, Dylan, you're not going to get off that easy. I was looking at the Headlands 50K is coming up here in a couple of weeks, and it's the US 50K champs again.
Remember when we did battle there?
Last time was the US 50K champs. We raced. Dylan was third in that race. And I did the compare efforts on us. Sure enough, Dylan was already showing that fatigue resistance. You were coming back so strong on me in that race. So you're a beast. But my favorite thing is I kind of love sometimes now when you're identified as a coach that you can just step out there and throw down, and it especially as I age, especially as I get a little bit older, I'm still got it, and so Silver Rush was so fun because I felt amazing all day, and ran really well out there, and it was a way to race into the Leadville 100-miler coming up here in a couple weeks from when we're recording. So just kind of fun to keep pushing limits, not knowing where those are. And it's the same reason that Megan, before she got pregnant, was going to do the Canyons 100K. It's if we're talking about learning on studies happening at these edges of knowledge, I think learning as an athlete and learning as a coach also happens at the edges. And, I keep wanting to test that edge, even if I'm not performing well in the future. I hope when I'm 60 coaching, I'm still testing my 60-year-old edges in the same way.
Well, I have a unique window into your fitness right now, as I'm sure people on Strava do as well. David's Strava is quite funny. You're, I think, the fittest you've ever been in your life. And I think as a 36-year-old dad, kind of new dad, and as a coach and everything that you do, only doing singles, it's actually really cool to think about how exercise physiology looks different for people and how this is your fittest. And whatever happens at Leadville 100, it's so cool to have that body of fitness and know that if it's not this race, it's another race, and that it carries on. The
best coach in the world right next to me, which is incredibly helpful. And then similarly, we're talking about performance improvements. I've been riding the same waves everybody else is, and just trying to practice what we preach and then learning from others. And also, even though we talk about coaching, we are learning from other coaches. I think that's one of the most significant things we try to do is like every field, we are not the keepers of knowledge. We are just gathering it from other places and then maybe adding a little bit at the edge. But like, you can't add more than a little bit at the edge, because like that just disregards the, all the brilliant people in this space. So we're constantly trying to learn in that way. And I think, over time we've changed. And I think for the most part, we've been influenced more by road track coaches, but significantly, like trail coaches and trails and ultras are doing that too. Like we mentioned Hannah Allgood, coached by Megan earlier. We have learned from Hannah in
she's
her
my
coaching.
coach.
I know, and she's crushing it.
Exactly.
I get so much joy out of that, Dylan. It's amazing. Every time you go race, I'm like, yes.
I got my intervals done this morning. I got my little
yeah.
strength exercise coming up this afternoon. She's kicking my butt, but I love it.
Post-exercise ketones?
Hell yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Boom.
But, Hannah, we've learned from Hannah. And it's essentially this like symbiosis of like learning from curious, open, smart people in every field is the coolest thing. And I think what's so fun about running right now from a performance perspective is that like we're rowing in the same direction for the most part. And like where that goes, I don't know exactly, but the fun part is when that happens, everybody improves. It's not just the fastest times at the front. That's a proxy for everyone feeling more empowered on their daily run. And I don't know, it starts in scientific journals maybe and some training theory stuff, but then where it ends up is like people doing airplane arms out on the trails.
Yeah. Say a few words about Matt Carpenter's record, because you talk, I mean, not saying that you're sort of calling your shot here, but you said something that I thought was interesting on the podcast about how obviously that's like one of, if not the most iconic long-standing course records in trail running back from 2005, I think 2006 maybe. So it's been around for nearly 30 years. And you basically said that, things are moving in a new direction here. And Matt Carpenter is obviously a legend, but that you think his record is well within, the possibility for the sport's top athletes right now, even though it hasn't really been challenged in 30 years.
I said that before I saw Hope Pass.
No. David saw Hope Pass and was like, do I want to start this race?
Yeah. No, JK. 2005 might as well be 1892 in the sport, in ultra running in particular. And with that in mind, like just statistics, and even Matt's other record, Pikes Peak, which got beaten by Remy, like there are people in the sport that on a great day could do it, but theoretically, like a great person could probably beat Usain Bolt's record on a great day. You have to do it. And I think that, 5 years from now, I assume it's going to be a distant memory depending on who does it. The question becomes like, who's going to take those shots? Because historically, not knowing the entire history of every time the race has been run, my guess is 20 people have raced it, already gone for it and not gotten it. And often DNF'd as a result. So, like the limits are being probed. The upper end competitiveness of Western states is higher than that of Leadville, just based on, historic trends. If we threw Jim Walmsley at Leadville, like I'm not betting against Jim Walmsley for anything.
God, that would be so sick, wouldn't
that be cool? Actually, question for you, Dylan. Is Zach Miller racing it? Do you know? He's been on course quite a bit.
Well, hey, that's interesting. What he told me at Hard Rock was that this is before he knew he wasn't going to start Hard Rock, when we were just speculating about what he could do. He said maybe Pikes Peak, maybe the Nolan's 14, which would make sense if he's putting in miles there, or potentially Diagonal Des Fous in October. He didn't mention Leadville though, but that would be rad.
He could get the course record. And again, I mentioned Jim Walmsley and Zach Miller. Like I knew Jim Walmsley, and you, sir, know Jim Walmsley. Talking to myself, but. I am fit, and you don't know how many shots you get in life. And, I respect the 100-mile distance. We've coached a lot of winners of Leadville and people that have run historically fast there. So I understand, but I'm like, part of the reason that all of this is happening gets back to that sports psychology moment, which is you don't land the vault unless you think you're going to land the vault. Simone Biles is not like, oh, I'm going to fall, and then gets a 10 out of 10 or whatever. Gets like an 8.9 execution score. Similarly, I think that we have to be open about that in running, that it's not calling your shot or whatever. It's like, full everything noted, like put yourself out there, give yourself a chance, embrace swag in this sport. Like you see swag embraced in every other sport, and it's easier for men, but women often, when they do this, have people just talking shit. And I'm like, no, actually that's what sports is all about. It's like life, We have enough insecurity. In sports, you bang your chest, you get out there, you scream, and you go for it.
Actually, this is the era of women's swag. I feel
exactly.
Courtney, Katie, and they're doing it well. And I think they're doing it authentically, and it's amazing.
Hell yeah. Embrace swag. Megan, another thing that you guys talked about recently, you just mentioned David being a 36-year-old dad. I'm a 38-year-old dad. And you guys were talking on the show about, age is something we all think about as athletes too. And obviously both masters course records were destroyed at Western States. We just saw Ludovic Pomeray break the course record.
That was wild.
Hard Rock. Courtney's 39. She's still unstoppable. So what do we know about aging and performance at this point? Asking for a friend, so to speak.
Yes. Well, I think there is. I think there's still a very particular point of aging where it's like, yes, aging exists, aging happens, and it's coming for us all in a beautiful way. It's such a beautiful part of life that we get to exist and go through these different physiological time points. But I think we are pushing that back. I think everything that makes sport elevate right now in terms of recovery tools, fueling being a big one. It's I wish I could go back to my 22-year-old self and fuel with 120 grams of carbs per hour, because it's what would that do in terms of my aging clock? It might push it back 5 years. And I think we're just continuing to push it back and push it back. And I think not only that, but then we're also building more slow twitch muscle fibers while we're at it as well. And it's I think for David, it's only been an advantage because you're a fast twitch boy. And with every year, with every candle on that cake, you're building more slow twitch muscle fibers, which is exciting. And so I think there's a number of different ways that we can look at it while not also being not facing the reality that at some point, aging is coming for us all, and it's going to look a lot like a different context. For me right now in pregnancy, I just put a towel over my watts on my Zwift because I was I don't want to see it. And
Bullshit. You didn't do that today when you were pushing your highest 30-second power outputs.
Let's go.
Yeah, I did do a workout today and it was nice. But at some point it's we have to be comfortable with the context of context shifting and, adventuring and still throwing down performances. And it might look different, but I think we can keep pushing that back.
And I think it's a great place to look at other sports. It's, aging is especially cruel in power sports because peak power happens early. I love the statistics on baseball in this, where essentially 25 is where that happens.
It's wild.
There used to be all this talk about, it's 31 when athletes, and it's no, any contract you give a 31-year-old in baseball, outside of the steroid era, usually not a great decision for these big business baseball teams. But in running, we don't care about peak power or reaction time. We care about endurance, all of these other elements we're talking about. And the cool thing is that reversal of peak power, it's not it goes anywhere. What it becomes is you have more slow twitch muscle fiber recruitment. Those same things that can be detriments in other sports can be advantages, especially in ultra running. So I think the thing that you do have to think about, though, is if peak power comes down, if the ceiling decreases a lot, eventually your aerobic threshold will be a certain percentage of that ceiling. So, maybe the thing we're most known for as coaches is strides and hills and things like that. And the reason is that peak power ends up being a large determinant of everything else. And yes, you can get to a high percentage of that peak power and sustain it if you have great endurance, but you will always be limited by that. And I would rather have someone with a really high ceiling and shitty fatigue resistance than someone with a low ceiling and great fatigue resistance, because that low ceiling, it's dropping every second. And so especially with if there's any athletes listening to this, I know there's everyone listens to Freetrail. If you're 60 years old, do your freaking hill strides and get that peak power up, because that is going to be your ultimate limiter. Everything else might actually be an advantage to you.
Awesome. That's so great. All right. Couple more things before we wind down here. I think it would be fun to just look ahead towards UTMB in the vein of talking about how much the game has changed recently. Last year, you guys came on our show in Chamonix and we talked about what I felt was a unique insight that you had, and that Western States was a cool year last year. There was a lot of people who were doing the double, and you were seeing with your athletes specifically that they were able to bounce back more quickly from Western States because it was a cool year. This year was a warmer year and people absolutely shredded Western States. There's a lot of people who are hoping to execute the double this year. So using that as a prompt for how you guys are thinking about UTMB, you can comment on that recovery window, specifically the double or anything else that you guys have in the back of your mind as coaches, scientists, observers of the sport before the biggest race in the world happens at the end of the month.
Oh, I'm so excited for UTMB. Last year we were like, we want to move to Chamonix. Like it's such an incredible environment. I feel like anyone that goes there is like, take me here, move me here. I think the double this year is very possible, much in the same way it was last year. Yes, the temperature context is different, but honestly, standing at that finish line of Western States, people have been subsequently a lot less wrecked than typically. Like I remember like 5 or 6 years ago standing at that starting line or the finish line, and it was carnage, like true carnage. And yes, there was some carnage at the finish line, but I don't think I saw it reflected across the top 10 or the top 20 in much the same way. And I think it's getting into like, athletes are cooling better. The fueling is so much better. The super shoes, heck, probably reduce, some of the muscle breakdown that we're seeing at the end of these long races. And so I think the recovery time in the double is very possible this year, even though it's hotter.
I also think hydration, something we haven't talked about, is getting dialed in a similar way, particularly with high electrolyte totals during races that are optimized for individual levels. For all these pros, know their sweat rates and how much sodium they need. And we're seeing less breakdown after races, quicker bounce backs. The athletes that we coached that were top 10 at Western States this year, they're all coming back strong as hell, stronger than ever. And at a certain point, maybe the cooling or the cooler temperatures was a red herring, almost distracting from the fact that every year is a cool year now at Western States when it comes to recovery, as long as athletes are doing the cooling, the fueling,
That's
and hydration.
So crazy, isn't it? It's like the heat is almost not a factor as long as you have a cooling strategy now.
Yeah. I mean, so many of my
crazy.
athletes, like during Western States and after, are like, I was honestly kind of cold the entire time because it's like, they're like, there's ice everywhere. Leah was leading this like massive ice train. She was like running down Forest Hill and there's just like ice coming out of her everywhere. And the athletes are often like cold during these races now.
And all these athletes are starting the races with a sky high blood volume from heat interventions. Like everyone is doing that. The heat acclimation stuff, that's 2010. That's ancient times in this. And then during the races, that blood volume in the old days used to be quite stressed because their core temps would go up, they'd get dehydrated. And then that's when you start to get this kidney stress and all these other damages that happen. Now people are just, you're not having the drift that you used to have with all these blood volume. Like essentially they're crossing the finish line with similar physiology as they hit the start line, just very tired physiology. Obviously there's exceptions to that, but I think we're going to see people bounce back so strong. And at UTMB specifically, what separates that race is it's a true mountain race, whereas Western States is not. And I think that those races are even more prone to broader scale improvements than we might even see at Western States. Maybe not at the top end, because the top end is already the freaks of the freaks, like Jim Walmsley, Courtney, Killian. All those people are, Zach, the best of the best. And we're not going to see like a fundamental outlier in that. But what we're seeing at all these races is like top 10, top 20, 30, whatever, getting faster. And at these mountain races, if what we end up being limited by is substrate availability, and you have this fueling capacity, and you have all these downhills to replace your glycogen because your heart rate's going to be lower, theoretically, I think the breakthrough we're going to start to see is that athletes race UTMB like they used to race CCC. And
go out harder.
Go out harder. I mean, that's basically what we're seeing is that athletes can go out harder because their physiology doesn't bonk after. And when that happens, I don't know where it goes, man. Like coaching this stuff gets complicated now because
crazy.
You're like, all right, I know where you're at and all of your numbers in the traditional tests we're talking, like VLT, VVO2, stuff like that. And yes, that's very good. But how should they actually race this when in the old days, maybe like good example, Chris Myers at Western States this year, who finished 10th in 15:18, historically blazingly fast time. It's like, well, when he's back next year, we're going out at 14:30 pace because that's how he's going to reach, because you have to. So it's going to be wild is all we know.
It's so crazy. It reminds me of something Rod said on my podcast recently about this phenomenon, and you guys have talked about it on your show too, about how the race starts at the start line now. It doesn't start at Forest Hill. And what he said was at Red Star Ridge, it was Jim Walmsley, Rod Farvard, Hayden Hawks, Danny Jones, 1 through 4th. They finished Jim Walmsley, Rod Farvard, Hayden Hawks, Danny Jones, 1 through 4. That's the second frickin' aid station on the frickin' course, for God's sakes.
Man, it's insane. I mean, I know at Leadville, endurance is my weak spot. 100 miles is so frickin' far. And realistically, every time I've stepped up in distance, I've had one race where my body needs to adapt and it doesn't go great. But just knowing what I know, I'm like, well, if I know what my Z2 pace is and that I can replace all the substrate and then some at a certain heart rate. Well, why do you go 20 beats per minute lower than that other than just making it take longer? You know, like all of these athletes, and that's where the speed of the sport matters, and that all of these athletes at the top end are also going to be just fast, because we're talking about substrate utilization and where their Z2 is, and all of that matters. And Western States has flat portions, whereas UTMB doesn't really have those, so it matters less. But, you know, for me, I'm like, I imagine I'm going to be running some 6-minute miles or 6:30 miles, just because it's like, well, if I go slower, it just makes everything take longer, and then it's going to be harder, but my heart's going to be lower either way. So I don't know. It's complicated.
It's also wild and interesting too. Like, I feel like at Western States, we used to be standing at Forest Hill and we would expect like 3 or 4 people within the top 10 to drop. And now it's like, we don't see that at all. And it's like athletes can start, you know, pushing faster, running faster, like having that substrate, but we don't see necessarily that drop either even on like really hot, hard, fast years. And that point is curious too.
Very interesting points all around. And I love that attitude going into Leadville, David. Matt Carpenter doesn't stand a chance.
Yeah, everyone's going to laugh so hard when I DNF at Twin Lakes.
I'm not letting you DNF at Twin Lakes.
Okay.
No way.
No. I mean, I'm going to go in.
The wife Uber will not be there.
Megan, she's joked about this. I go in, I get very confident the day before. But leading up to it though, I'm full eyes open that, like, you know, when you try hard things often happen.
That's true, but you can't drop out, because we can sort of wind down on this. You got another kid coming.
Yeah, you gotta
get this out of the way before.
No, I mean, Megan, we have another unexpected kid coming. I think the problem was that I finished.
Sorry. I was actually going to make this same exact joke.
Was that okay?
Yeah, but I didn't have the Duende to make it. So thank you.
Good wholesome family humor here on the podcast. But we started the show here today with a sentimental sort of like renewing of vows, as I said. And obviously, you guys are a married couple, you're colleagues, you share everything together. Megan, you're in your second trimester now, expecting your second child. So maybe we can close on this, just looking forward to expanding the family, and then maybe also like practically fitting it together with coaching and athletic careers with a family life, as I know it's not always easy.
Oh yeah. I feel like we're in this place right now where we're actually trying not to think about it too hard, because it's like with Leo, our first, it was like, there's so many unexpected things that we just kind of like pivoted with on the spot. But I think we're excited. I think, yeah, that's a strong point. We are excited.
Yeah.
Leo has just been the best adventure. And like, I don't know, I feel like constantly when I'm with Leo, my eyes open to like new ways of seeing the world. Like when I'm hiking, I'm like, oh, that's an excavator, or that's like, I just like see trucks and buses, and even hiking like trees and rocks in different ways. And it's like, it's truly such a gift, and it comes with a lot with it. And I'm sure a second will too, but I'm really excited for it. And I feel like we've pivoted, we've learned, we've grown. Maybe we've dialed things back a bit, but I think it's been for the best.
Yeah. Megan's the best mom in the world, which makes my life, like my job, much easier. We lucked out with Leo, you know,
he's chill.
We've been trying to raise Leo like we talk to athletes, you know, where it's just all love all the time, and we'll see how that turns out when he's 18. But thus far, a little pressure. And you know, every kid's unique when they come out. But I think for this topic, what Megan was just talking about reminds me of an incredible comedy special called The New One by Mike Birbiglia. And if anyone has never had kids and is like me, you're on the fence, you just aren't sure about kids in general, watch it, because the way he talks about how you see the world is so true. And it's not dissimilar, and I might get hate for this, than having a dog.
I was literally just thinking the exact same thing. Yeah. I was like, Addie Dog functionally did a lot of that for us. And I think like you can get a lot of the child experience by having animals too.
Yeah. Addie didn't come out through Megan's orifices, but
yeah, thank God.
Similarly, like though, there's just this ability to, I don't know, be a little bit more in tune with things that might pass by otherwise. So yeah, the last 21 months have been a lot, but like they've definitely passed more slowly. We've lived more life than we did before. And, you know, if the whole point is to live life while you're here, like, I don't know, I feel like that's the ultimate way to spend it. So I don't know. I'm trying to convince myself. I for those that don't listen to our podcast, I was team no kids. We had an argument before Leo.
So were we.
Yeah.
Yeah. The best way to do it is just
Now I want a soccer team, Paul.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Or you just David wasn't sure about a second kid, and sometimes you just do it by accident, and then we get a second child.
But Megan convinced me on the podcast essentially to go for the first one. So, just anyone out there, like your life choices and decisions. It's I think everyone always says it was meant to be after the fact. And what they're saying is not that specific thing was meant to be. It's not that a kid was meant to be or whatever. It's that, going through life day to day and facing the adversity of it changes you in such a way so that for that version of you, it was meant to be because it's the only version of you that could exist. And so, I love this version of Megan. She's the best mom in the world. I love this version of Leo. And, I love the version of me that being a dad has made me. So put all that together and wouldn't have it any other way. But the flip side of that is if it had gone another way, I would have loved that too, because you have to.
We are living a lot of life. He makes a flight to Chamonix. I feel like we've lived for 2 years. So, it's like, talk about the aging process. I feel like I'm simultaneously like 55 in my 34-year-old body.
Also, he slept till 9:30 a.m. this morning. So
wow.
That's rare. That's rare.
That's a course record as far as I'm concerned.
He is, the hard part here is everyone says your second kid is totally different than your first. And I've joked with Megan, I'm about to become a dad because I haven't felt like we've been fortunate with the sleep on that front. So
us too.
It's going downhill. I can promise.
It reminds me when I was driving home from Hard Rock, Harmony and Rhodes flew. So Dad had a couple days solo in the rig, and I was driving through Ely, Nevada, and there was a billboard or a sign that said, "Kids don't listen to your advice, they follow your example." And I feel like you guys do such a good job of just like living and leading by example. I ask everybody the same closing question here on the podcast. That is just, who is one person that you admire? Can be inside or outside of sport, living or dead. Why do you admire that person? Megan, you get us started.
Ooh, I like this one. Well, I feel like we've been on an Olympic streak recently. Like, we've been watching so many Olympic sports, and there's honestly, I have a list of like hundreds of people that I admire, but I think the topical one of the week is Alana Mayer, who's a female rugby player from the US, who is stepping up and talking about like hard things like body image and fueling, and simultaneously like being like this person who contains multitudes, and the fact that she loves like beauty and showing up as a woman, and then she goes out on the rugby field and just like freaking decks people in like the best way possible. And I just love an athlete coming together, containing multitudes, containing many different types of identities, and doing so in a fueled body while like spreading love for carbs. And I'm like, that's the best.
Carbs is
totally the answer. My inspiration.
It's so good.
Hell yeah.
So I was going to say Simone Biles, but we get how great she is in her mental health journey. I'm going to flip it around and say Harmony, actually.
I love this. Harmony is the best.
So Dylan's partner, Harmony, she, every time, and it gets back to our tribute to Maddie, every time I've interacted with Harmony, she makes me feel better about myself. And like, I know she does that for everybody, but that's something that clearly, to do that, you see the darkness in the world, you see all of these things, and you come out the other end being like, I'm going to help other people through this. And our interactions have always been pretty small, but it's clear that that's just the type of person she has decided to be. And to anyone who makes that decision, that like scary decision where you're going to get burned, it's like, fuck yeah, that's the person I want to be.
Well, do you know what my dream is? It's to grow and to coach a soccer team with Dylan and Harmony.
Let's go.
Let's do it.
Could you imagine the dominance? We'd be like the Courtney Dauwalter of children's soccer.
It would be so fun.
Can you imagine how many gels those kids are going to have at halftime? It's like, no more orange slices.
Sodium bicarbonate. Sodium bicarbonate.
Ketones in a 5-year-old for sure.
Don't give your 5-year-old.
I know. That's a joke.
I know. I just want to make sure.
Yeah. So good. Well, thank you guys so much for coming on the show. Thanks for being such a positive influence for the sport, for always leading by example, as I said, and appreciate everything you put out into the universe too. I've learned so much, and I'm glad to be able to finally share it here on our podcast too.
Oh,
thank you so much.
That means the world. Also, thank you, Dylan and Harmony. Like, I'm blown away by the amount of hustle that you have between events and Freetrail and TrailCon. And it honestly blows my mind, both from like a business in life and just like the goodness that you put out in the world perspective. And I truly don't know how it's possible. I imagine you guys drink a lot of caffeine. I see some Red Bulls back there. But you guys blow me away on the daily.
You know what we need to do?
What?
Dylan and I podcast Dudes Talking Sports. Not running.
Yeah.
We can be about running, but other things too. That'd be pretty cool. So
That
You
is
mean
like
soccer?
that's straight up. That's straight in my wheelhouse, Mr. Roche.
I know. It's like,
Anytime, any place.
the fact that we haven't been like done it yet is a problem. But more specifically to everyone listening, Freetrail, subscribe to Freetrail. Give them a monthly subscription. I know that you're listening to this and like you don't think it means much, but that stuff is what makes this possible. And Freetrail is lifting all the boats. So one thing we didn't talk about on the podcast, and I know I'm rambling, but whatever, is that building the denominator of the sport is the way to grow everything for everyone, every opportunity, every race. And Freetrail is an engine that is pushing everything, not just podcasts and Freetrail's own initiatives, but what we do, what every coach out there does, what every journalist does, everything that you see. And if you can contribute a few dollars a month to Freetrail, that is a good way to contribute to everyone. It's like one of those donations that has a broader impact than you see. So do it. They're fighting the good fight.
Thank you guys so much. It's an honor to have you on the show, and obviously the SWAT Patreon's also open for business.
Go to Freetrail first.
Yeah. Spend your money wisely.
David Roche, Dr. Megan Roche, thank you guys so much for coming on the show.
Awesome. It was a blast.
Love you guys.